Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I rise to decry this lazy government. This is just window dressing. It is avoiding the clear problems. At Pauline Hanson's One Nation, we are certainly no fan of the banks. We have proclaimed for some time now that a Royal Commission is needed into the banking sector. In the inability to have that passed so far, we have worked to get the Senate Select Inquiry into lending to rural production customers. And I have been selected by Senator Hanson to chair the committee that she managed to negotiate. We have also become a co-sponsor of the Commission into Banking, and we are proud to join Senator Whish-Wilson in that initiative. But bank bashing itself, Mr Acting Deputy President, does no good if it simply avoids the core issues. This is just yet another example of policy in the run, as we've come to see. This will be passed on to customers, and I'll read some quotes from the Centre for Independent Studies study into this banking bill, this banking levy. But let's, before I do that, look at an overview of what's happening in our country. Cost of living is foremost on people's minds. Last year, wages rose, or incomes rose 1.9%, excuse me, while prices rose 2.1%, while cost of living rose 2.1%. That is a backward step for everyday Australians. Real issues include energy, prices skyrocketing. Senator Brandis today said that under the Liberal Party, prices for energy are stabilising. Oh, really? In South Australia, when the Liberal Party came into power in the federal government, South Australian prices have risen from 5 cents per kilowatt hour to now be at 16 cents. That's over 3 times. That's not stability. The Victorian government, in Victoria, prices rose from 5 cents per kilowatt hour to 11 cents, a more than doubling. Queensland doubled from 5 to 10. That is not stability. That is ignorance. We look at over-regulation. When I listen to people in Queensland, the constituents in Queensland, over-regulation is their second most mentioned hurdle. Over-regulation, killing small businesses, killing personal enterprise, choking farmers, choking small businesses, choking individual income earners. And then the third, hardly any surprise, is it? Tax. Tax has gone out of control in this country. Why do we tax payroll? We all know that when we tax something, it decreases the use of that object that's being taxed. So why are we taxing payroll? Do we really want to decrease payroll? Excuse me. I'm getting choked up over this, so to speak. But then we tax the PAYE tax. That is also a tax on employment. And then what do we see from the government? And what do we see from the opposition? They blame the Senate for not being able to tackle the real issues. That is a lazy approach, and I'll give you an example of a first-class international leader not so long ago who inspired me. Government is not a right. It doesn't mean that because people get elected into the government benches that they get whatever they want. That is not their right. The opposition's job is to oppose that and come up with better options. And the crossbench senator's job is to continue to work that even stronger and make something workable from the opposition and the government. In 1980, I was fortunate to be in the United States when President Reagan was inaugurated. I watched that man. He didn't complain about the Democrats having the majority in the lower house when he was a Republican president. No, he didn't. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He got the data, and he made a presentation to every person in America through the TV one night. And all he did was take 5 or so graphs on an easel. Simple graphs, simple language, everyday connection with the real people across America. And what happened? As a result of his forthright leadership, his understanding of the basic issues addressing every American, 40 Southern Democrats jumped ship and joined the Republicans to vote in favour of President Reagan's economic initiatives. That's cost of living. What about the fact that governments continue to just keep pushing costs onto people through mad policy? The Murray-Darling Basin spending billions, $13 billion and counting, on public money, taxpayer money, to buy water rights, to sell water eventually, to put it in a foreigner's hands. A policy perpetuated by the Labor Party and perpetuated by the current Liberal Party, initiated by the current Prime Minister. The energy policy, I've just given you an example, but we see regulation causing the destruction of our energy sector. There is no more vital sector in this country, no more vital sector in an industrial country. And what is happening is we are seeing the de-industrialisation of our wonderful country. We see regulations choking the energy sector. The problem is clearly regulation. And what does the Finkel review come up and say? We need more regulation as the solution. What a dishonest mess. And then we see climate change policy. Climate change policy that contradicts empirical evidence, the real world, hard, measured data, contradicted by our policies. All of these things and many, many more are raising costs directly and indirectly through the imposts of government. Then turn to the post office and how this government and its predecessors have been screwing people who are trying to do a hard job, do a good job in this country, and finding it very hard to do so. The CEO of Telstra, of Australia Post, I beg your pardon, Mr. Acting Deputy President, recently resigned after receiving a salary of over $5 million a year and receiving a payment of $2 million, I believe, for severance. Reportedly $8 million in his last year. And then we see the salaries of department heads right across the federal government, departments and government agencies. $400,000, $600,000, $680,000, $800,000, $900,000, $1 million, over $1 million, and Ahmed Fahour, many millions. And then we see, when we delve into the actual increases of that 1.9% increase in incomes, we see that those in the private sector got an increase of 1.8%. And they paid for an increase of 2.4% in the public service. And then what do we see? We see post office franchisees in my office last Thursday detailing that in their commitment that Australia Post has given them, they are entitled to receive $1.38 for 20 minutes work because the banks have left town and they're now the banker's agency. 20 minutes work for $1.38 pay. That is not sustainable. That is disgraceful. And then the CEO makes out like a bandit. And then we see welfare. It's on the it's on the lips of so many Australians, the abuse of welfare. Senator Hanson has been proclaiming her national identity card, the Australia card. A reputable economic consultancy has recently valued it at saving more than $4 billion each and every year once it's put into place. And then it would also save money in health. It would increase revenue through the avoiding of people now avoiding paying fair tax and fulfilling their responsibilities. So it would save many, many more billions of dollars than this initiative with the banks. And then fourthly, looking at something more broadly, there's the states. And what happened to competitive federalism? Competitive federalism was designed by the forefathers of our Constitution to put in place a check against a rampant central government. We now have rampant central government in our country, sadly. It is running out of control. We now have the states. In fact, 20 years ago, the states found that they were getting more than 50% of their revenue from federal government, under federal control. Listening to the people, the Shire councillors, the Deputy Mayor at Balonne Shire Council, just February, they said that 73% of the Balonne Shire Council's annual revenue comes from the federal government, with no security of ongoing payment, just conditions that change periodically. So who is running the Balonne Shire Council? The federal government. Who is running the states? The Murray-Darling Basin covers 80% of New South Wales. Who controls the water rights? Who controls the land rights, the property rights? Who controls the income of so many states and federal and local councils? The federal government. So we've now got a de facto or powerful federal government. So what we've also seen is the need for looking back in our history, because there are many solutions we can find. If we look to the Commonwealth Bank that was formed in 1911 after the legislation passed by the Fisher Labor government, and we saw that Australia flourished and blossomed under that Commonwealth banking initiative. We saw Denison Miller invest money through the Australian people, invest money in developing Australian infrastructure, developing Australian agriculture, developing Australian transport overseas, giving us access to international markets. We now see the Bank of North Dakota, the public Bank of North Dakota. That's right, an American state has a public bank, and it is one of the very few banks that has continually made profits ever since its inception, that is continuing to give cheap loans to its farmers and its business people, that is continuing to put dividends back into the hands of the state government, back into the coffers of the people of North Dakota, much like the Commonwealth Bank. So let's get into some more details after that overview and think of some of the comments, reading from the Centre for International Independent Studies in Sydney. Who pays the levy? Well, the banking levy will most likely be passed on, it says, as increases in mortgage and business interest rates. This expectation is based on overseas experience, including in research cited by the government and in analysis by Australian experts. As a result, the levy will act as a tax increase on households. Cost of living? A tax increase on households who are already afflicted by flatlining real wages, growth and ongoing increases in personal tax, including through bracket creep. The ratio of personal tax to gross domestic product has been increasing by about 0.3 percentage points per year cumulative since the global financial crisis. An increase in business borrowing rates will dampen business investment, it says, which is already at near record lows as a share of the economy and is forecast to decline further. Only a fool or a cynic would laugh. But that is what we hear. Then we see, based on an IMF study, according to the Centre for Independent Studies, Australia's levy could reduce GDP by about $1.7 billion per year, a substantial impact compared to the revenues raised of $1.5 to $1.6 billion per year. In the executive summary, the Centre for Independent Studies says the bank levy is likely to feed through to higher mortgage and interest lending rates. As I've said, this will hit many households already facing tax increases. Secondly, if the big banks have substantial market power, as the government already implies, the banks could just use this power to ensure the levy is fully passed on to customers. We can't have it both ways. They either have substantial market power or they don't. If they have substantial market power, then they'll just pass it on. The government, thirdly, cannot use international experience to justify the levy, as many other developed countries have chosen not to implement a levy on borrowings. Fourth, the levy will help mortgage customers only if they switch to smaller banks and then those smaller banks cut mortgage rates. The government has provided no evidence that this will occur. The process for developing the levy breaches numerous government requirements for best practice regulation and consultation. and that could be an echo in this chamber. How many times do we see government requirements for best practice regulation and consultation just bypassed? Next, the harmful impact of the levy appears small, but this in no way justifies the levy. A bad policy is bad no matter what its size, and the levy rate could easily be increased in the future to have a large adverse impact, an adverse impact on households right across the country. Former Prime Minister John Howard, just 2 weeks ago, was quoted in the newspaper on a Saturday saying that he is appalled at energy policy, and he quoted and specifically referred to the renewable energy target, favouring intermittent energy sources. Who introduced the renewable energy target? Former Prime Minister John Howard's government. Who accelerated it? The governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. Both parties, who have been responsible for government, irresponsible government in the last couple of decades. In fact, since 1940s, have been responsible. And who pays? Mums and dads, boys and girls, families, small businesses right around this country. The Centre for Independent Studies concludes, given these flaws in the levy, it should be abandoned in its entirety. However, if the levy is not abandoned, it should be subject to a much more detailed inquiry over the coming year, with a consequent delay in the start date. This detailed inquiry would enable the government to meet its own guidelines for best practice regulation, ensure unintended consequences are known, if not addressed, and allow interactions to be considered, including interactions with bank prudential regulations and the inquiry into the Productivity Commission by the Productivity Commission into competition in the financial sector. Mr. Acting Deputy President, we need to face up to the real issues. The real issues are the abysmal lack of accountability in governance from the central Commonwealth government at the moment in this country. We need to face up to the enormous and rapidly increasing cost of living burden on every person in this country, every working man and woman and their kids. And we need to face up to the severe, daunting challenges for economic security that people just in the government and the opposition just seem to turn a blind eye to. Our economic security is at threat. Energy prices for the last 170 years until 10 years ago, since the Industrial Revolution, have continually decreased in real terms. That is the secret to an increasing standard of living for 160 years. And in the last 10 years, through insanity and through contradiction of the empirical evidence, we have seen policy after policy destroying our economy, destroying the key energy sector, destroying livelihoods, killing jobs and sending them overseas where they're increasing real pollutants, particulates, sulphur dioxide, nitrous oxide. This is insane what is happening in our country. And the people who are paying for this insanity are everyday mums and dads. That is why we will be opposing this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President.
Thank you, Senator Roberts.